Hey you, I'm into Jesus. Hey you, I'm into Jesus. Hey you, I'm into Jesus. Feminine ladies and violent gentlemen, welcome. I'm Trevor Sines. This is your ab-indigenous polymathic mystagogic polemist at Mythological Myth. Welcome everybody. Thank you for watching. Today we're going to talk about infamous Scopes monkey trial. Yes, we'll talk about that in a minute, but did you know like 322 Christians are killed every month for their faith, according to Open Doors? Over 200 churches and Christian properties are destroyed each month, and there are over 700 forms of violence committed against Christians around the world each month. May not seem like a lot, huh? 700? But imagine if it was 700 people that you knew. Without further ado, feminine ladies and violent gentlemen.
Jill Lepore, the Kemper Professor of American History at Harvard and of equal or greater moment, staff writer for The New Yorker. Tell us about your...
Yeah, the changing of my mind did not warrant coverage in the New York Times. I'm here to model changing your mind about something that seems to be of no consequence, but that is a matter of kind of private integrity. So this is more in the manner of true confessions. I wrote a history of the United States a few years back, and I was looking out for places where I was making assumptions about things that had happened and interpretations that were just really received wisdom to me in order to force myself to go back to the primary sources and genuinely evaluate the material.
Big kudos to Professor Jill Lepore for coming out and doing this a few years ago. But how many people know about this? How many people know about the implications that I'm about to share with you?
And so when I got to the Scopes trial in 1925, the trial of John Scopes for the teaching of evolution in violation of law passed in Tennessee, I knew that I knew everything that I knew about the Scopes trial from watching Inherit the Wind, the 1960 movie with Spencer Tracy.
That documentary, that was great.
Yeah, that documentary, based on a play written in 1955 that mobilizes the story of the Scopes trial as part of an effort to take down McCarthy.
Did you hear what just happened here? A Harvard professor, okay, very influential, big school professor, admits that pop culture had a major influence, and she had to go back and take a look at primary sources. That means court documents, filings, newspaper articles, eyewitness testimony, affidavits, and things like that. Not secondhand, like news sources, movies, TV shows.
I'm sad to say Spencer Tracy didn't call me after I changed my mind about his depiction of Clarence Darrow. But when I went back and actually read about Bryan, so Bryan is also much mocked in historical scholarship, generally by liberal scholars, kind of beginning with Richard Hofstadter. Everybody thought William Jennings Bryan, who was known as Mr. Fundamentalist, was essentially an idiot. Clarence Darrow famously called him the idol of all morondom. He's really skewered by H.L. Mencken during the Scopes trial in particular. Eugene Debs, the socialist, called him a prophet of the Stone Age. He's ridiculed by his contemporaries and by historians as having been kind of a dupe.
He was lambasted. She emphasizes this. Everybody pay attention. Christians especially pay attention. This is the 20th century. There was so much money poured behind John Scopes, his defense against the Tennessee Department of Education. So much media and attention went behind this. It shows you the force of this theory. Now disproven as so improbable that it's impossible, but there were so much lobbying money, so much media. Do you think the Trump era, the Biden era, do you think this era of media influence, like Twitter being exposed, Facebook and things like that, do you think that was bad? This started back here. Famous trial.
And essentially an intellectual fraud. But
this is a map. I'll show it again in a little bit. The striped areas are areas that had laws in effect to sterilize make people not be able to get pregnant. Okay, these are states in 1935 in America. South Carolina, North Carolina, I think, came out with apologies in 2011. Some kind of apologies attempting to make reparations for sterilizing thousands of Black Americans and who couldn't have kids. They just stopped their family names. Texas, look at that. Pending legislation in Texas. The only places, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, and some southern states like Louisiana and Arkansas. Okay, western states, they probably didn't have too much organization going on in 1935 as far as that goes, so we don't know why they weren't or didn't. Maybe they were more whatever, keen, like the other states.
But if you actually, I grew very suspicious of that portrayal of Bryan, who was nothing if not sincere in his embrace of the common people. He was a populist who brought together the People's Party and the Democratic Party in the election of 1896, and he had the misfortune to die immediately after the Scopes trial, 5 days later after the strain of a heart attack in his bed, so could never defend himself from the depiction of how he had waged the defense, the prosecution on behalf of the state of Tennessee.
William Jennings Bryan was a lawyer. He was a Christian. He ran for president. He fought for the less fortunate, like Jesus was for the poor. In James, Jesus said, "Why do you favor the rich that come into your synagogues and churches?" Think about that nowadays when we say, "Oh, the poor," who cares about the poor? Have you read Leviticus? Have you read the Old Testament regarding immigrants? Yeah, I know I'm not going to ring bells. I'm not all for totally open borders, but treating immigrants as less than human is what's happening in our current present situation.
In that trial. But I was really compelled by this essay that by a lot of stuff about Bryan, including a great biography by Michael Kazin called The Godly Hero. But taking Bryan in his own words, he wrote this essay in 1921 called The Menace of Darwinism, in which it became really clear to me that to the degree that Bryan was an unsettled thinker, he did not distinguish between Darwinism as a scientific theory and social Darwinism as a political practice. And when he...
Okay. Scientific racism, like eugenics, scientific racism grew out of the misappropriation of revolutionary advances in medicine, anatomy, and statistics. Oh, the zealot anti-theist always gets an out, just like Piltdown, the hoax of Piltdown Man, the hoax of the cartoons that go from simple structures to fish to monkeys to advanced hominids. Okay. The second bullet, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution through the mechanism of natural selection. Like eugenics, scientific racism grew out of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. It was a consequence. Let's go on.
Attack Darwinism. He was attacking social Darwinism. He was an advocate of the poor. And he, in this essay, he says, we would never have passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. It's we would never have passed most progressive legislation if people really believed Darwin.
Involuntary sterilization, segregation, and social exclusion. Hello. Yes, many articles came out during COVID about this relation to the 1920s and 30s eugenics in America and forced vaccination. They were saying it's the same as forced sterilization. This is not a political issue on either side. This is a reality we've been dealing with.
Darwinism, and that the poor should be left to die off, that those who do not thrive should be allowed to die off.
North Carolina's eugenics passed. They sterilized thousands of Black people so that they would not make future generations. This was well talked about in scientific literature. It was not conspiracy. It is not controversy now. It's just across the board.
The survival of the fittest argument of social Darwinism was what he was arguing against. And he looked at a state like Tennessee where
in California, forced sterilization. Asexualization Acts of California. Does that remind you of something today where pregnant moms have this state program to do genetic testing to see if your baby has Down syndrome or anything like that? Sound familiar? Selective. Oh, those baby. That's for the purpose of letting you know you should have an abortion to do away with the less fortunate.
The public schools were teaching poor kids who had been poor whose families had been poor for generations. And
Kansas develops fitter families, a remarkable experiment in eugenics. Kansas touted itself as the progressive state. Have you been there? Have you been through there?
And said, how will these kids know that they can thrive if they are taught Darwinism? And for me, that was a really...
And they targeted black people, folks, because Darwin and those fellows of him treated people less than human. Even the Jews were targeted as less than human, less than a favored race. But the blacks really got most of it. 65% of all sterilizations of women were black women. Okay.
Really powerful way to think about what Bryan's project was and what the state of Tennessee was actually motivated by.
This website here is a government website, y'all. NIH, folks.
Which absolutely included religious fundamentalism, but really included a progressive social vision that had been Clarence Darrow's vision. Darrow, the famous defense attorney who went to defend John Scopes in this show trial. And there's a line from that Bryan piece, The Menace of Darwinism, that I really love.
In 2017, a judge in Tennessee offered reduced jail sentence for voluntary sterilization. 2009, West Virginia, marijuana violation. Sterilization, part of probation. 2018, Oklahoma woman sentenced, convicted of her crime, reduced sentence after undergoing sterilization.
Where he's sort of indicting the kind of hubris of modernism against tradition, and indicting really men of science, but what he means really is more, again, the Herbert Spencer sort of social Darwinism. He said, men who would not cross the street to save a soul have traveled across the world in search of skeletons. That there's just something about that gesture of scientific research in the abstract that fails to attend to the suffering of people left behind by modernity, that I just found incredibly powerful. And so I changed my mind about the Scopes trial.